Afternoon. I'm Mike Perry, the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and we're pleased that you're here today to engage in a conversation with Colonel Retired Frank Hancock, who's going to talk about his reflections on Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and why he does thank God for thinking soldiers. Colonel Hancock is a graduate of the United States Military Academy, graduated in 1972. He was a commissioned infantry officer who served 30 years with the Army, with assignments 25th in Europe, and most notably with the 101st. And in 1990 and 1991, or 1989 and 1990.
1990.
Yeah, he served as the commander of the 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment during Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. He ended his career as the chairman of the Department of Military Plans and Strategy and Operations at the U.S. Army War College. Frank, the floor is yours.
So we're going to get started. Before I start with the presentation, I want to thank everybody that's on it and introduce, when he comes on the screen, one of my Pizos here from central Pennsylvania. And it's Warren Tafford Jones, the young man that is, when he comes up, you'll be seeing him. He was a Vietnam War veteran and fought with the 101st, most notably at Hamburger Hill. So today we're going to talk about Desert Storm, and we're going to take a look back at it. During Desert Storm, I was, like Mike said, a battalion commander. In the 101st Airborne Division, I was Infantry Battalion, and I had a pretty good look at it. The 101st was an early deploying unit, and so I got to see it pretty much from the beginning to the end in April of '91. So if you go to a bookstore and you go to Barnes and Noble, which of course you can't, but if you could, and you went to Barnes and Noble, you wouldn't find any books about Desert Storm. And there's some reasons for that. The first one is, if you take a look at Desert Storm, it was a relatively easy fight, right? It looked like that we went through the Iraqis pretty quickly. Number two, it was a victory. A lot of people believe that you can't get anything out of a victory, that you need to get beaten down, and then perhaps once you get beaten down, you'll learn the lessons learned. And the last thing is, perhaps, since there weren't, relatively speaking, a lot of casualties, well, maybe you can't learn anything from it because of that. Well, I think most of that is wrong, right? It's been 30 years, and I think there are some lessons to be learned, or relearned in some cases, for why it went so quickly and why it looks so effortless. So if you would, put on your seatbelt. We're going to go in the Wayback Machine, and we're going to go back to 1990. So if you were looking at the person or the reason why Desert Storm, and Desert Storm was the fighting part of the Persian Gulf War. Desert Shield was the defense of Saudi Arabia. But why Desert Storm came about, you have no farther to look than this guy right here, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the dictator of Iraq. He was a pirate. He was a thug's thug. And what he had just done, he had just fought a very bloody war against the Iranians. It went from 80 to 88. And some people say that the casualties, estimated casualties between the two, it was over a million casualties between the Iraqis and the Iranians. And he was out of money. So being the good pirate thug that he was, he went around to see if he could get his debt relieved. First, he went to the Kuwaitis and to the Saudis. They held most of his debt and tried to convince them, hey, can you take away this financial burden? And of course, they both said, no, show me the money. We want you to pay up. So after those negotiations failed, he started negotiating with the Kuwaitis. And with the Kuwaitis, he said, you know that oil that you're getting from the Ramallah oil fields. That really comes from Iraq. How about relieving my debts? And they go, no, we're not going to do that. So on August the 2nd, breaking all kind of, I don't know, maybe it was the original fake news that Arab countries would not invade other Arab countries, he invades Kuwait. And so around August the 5th, he had completed in 3 days the conquering of Kuwait. Kuwait's a small country, but he also, and I'll talk later about it, Saddam had a big army. And then ominously, his forces did a right turn and headed south toward the Saudi Arabian borders. Of course, when they did this, there's all kinds of bells and whistles that went off in Washington, because Saudi Arabia was at that time the largest oil producer of oil in the world. And if Saddam took Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, he would control over 1/5 of the world's oil reserves. So the Bush administration sent, I believe it was Secretary of Defense CHENEY and General SCHWARZKOPF to the Saudis, took them and brought the overflight photos of where those armored forces were of the Iraqis, and they became concerned and told the Americans, you can bring military assets in. So when that occurred, the defense of Saudi Arabia, or Desert Shield, began. So this is the command group, or the National Command Authority for the United States at that time. There was President Bush the first, Vice President QUAYLE, Secretary of Defense CHENEY, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Powell, and the CENTCOM commander, Central Command Commander, General SCHWARZKOPF. A little about my perceptions. These are my perceptions. I thought they were competent, I thought they were confident, and I thought they were serious people. And I did not think they were going to get me or my men killed needlessly. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about Norman Schwarzkopf there. If you think back about Schwarzkopf, Schwarzkopf was like the perfect fit to command CENTCOM at that time. His bio reads like, this person we're going to groom to become the CENTCOM commander. Again, I thought he was competent, confident, and my one cherished moment with Schwarzkopf, I'll give a little anecdote here, is I was at a meeting when he came down to my division, the 101st, after the war was over. And we were briefing about our operations, and there came a point where my name was mentioned. And Schwarzkopf turns around and gives me a head nod. And I'm thinking to myself, who's the man? I'm the man. Schwarzkopf gave me a head nod. He didn't verbally acknowledge me. He didn't call my name. He just, yeah, you exist. And so for me, that was a cherished memory. In thinking back, and again, for me, I was there, and thinking back about Desert Shield and Desert Storm, this is my no kidding slide, because my perception was how big this operation was. And so what I want to do is just kind of take you through some of the things that made it big, and then talk about some first. I have a historian, Miss Janelle, who is my boss now, and she loves first. So what I'm going to do is give you some of those. So, number one, Iraq at that time had a 1 million-man army. It was the 4th largest in the world, and they had stationed 400,000 of them inside Kuwait. It was a modern army. It had T-55 tanks, T-62 tanks, T-72 tanks. They were kind of a Soviet clientele, so most of their weaponry was from Russia. And the T-72 was one of the best tanks in the world. They had a lot of artillery. They had Scud missiles. Their aircraft were MiG-23s, MiG-25s, and MiG-29s, which is more or less frontline aircraft. And for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, they had poison gas. They had chemical assets of sarin, which is a nerve agent, and mustard. And during the Iranian war, they had used it. So not only did they have it, they certainly had shown that they were willing to deploy it. For the coalition, our side, there were 37 nations, over 800,000 servicemen were deployed in the area. For the United States, we're going to send over 500,000, 550,000 American servicemen. The Navy had 12 carrier battle groups. They're sending 6 of them. Half of the Navy's fleet is going to the area. The carrier battle group has a carrier, and then it's supporting ships. They would put 2 in the Red Sea, and they're going to put 4 in the Persian Gulf. The Air Force and the Navy were going to send 1,800 aircraft. The total coalition had 22. And the Marine Corps, they're going to send 2 Marine Expeditionary Forces there. Marine Expeditionary Forces, a force that probably has between 20 and 40,000 Marines in it. The U.S. Army would send the largest amount. We're going to send 1 field army, 3rd Army under General Yosak. We're going to send 2 corps underneath that Army. It would be 18th Airborne Corps under Lieutenant General Gary Luck, and 7th Corps, which was a heavy armor corps coming out of Germany under Lieutenant General Freddie Franks. We're going to send 9 divisions are going to deploy, and 42 states are going to send Guard and Reserve units. And at that time, of course, the Army could not do without our Guard and Reserve units. Some firsts. And here we go to the first. I'm just going to read these off and explain to you. First time we're going to use stealth, right? The F-117s are going to fly in on the first mission into Baghdad, and they had that radar bouncing off material. It's going to be the first time we're going to pull units out of Germany to go fight anywhere. Up until that time, the forces in Germany go nowhere. They stay and fight the NATO battle. But we're going to take 7th Corps, or one of our 2 corps out, and swing it to the Middle East. It's going to be the first time we have fought in the desert since 1943. Last time we had fought in the desert was in North Africa. The first time the Army in an operation is going to truly have to prepare to get attacked with chemical weapons. World War II, a little bit. This, one of my biggest headaches, and everybody's biggest headaches, is we were pretty much sure we were going to get slimed. And of course, the way you decontaminate, we've always been taught, is you take water and then you take dirt and mix it together, you get the slurry, and then you decontaminate. Well, there wasn't any water. You go out and you have 2 canteens, that's all the water. So it was a big, big problem. It's going to be the largest tank battle since 1943, and Kursk between the Soviets and the Germans. It's going to be the biggest and largest heliborne attack in the history of warfare. What that means is this heliborne attack is you're going to load, and what eventually occurred, 2,000 people take them 120 kilometers and drop them off, and then come back. Biggest ever. It was going to be the first time we used GPS. We had these rudimentary GPS devices called sluggers and pluggers, and everybody had them. Otherwise, I would have been like Moses, and I'd have still been wandering out in the desert for 10 more years, because I never could find out where I was at. First time we're going to have this plethora of precision weapons. We're going to be shooting through doorways and windows that you saw on TV. First time that everyone more or less had a computer. First time that we had space assets used in an operational design. First time we're going to move in 4 months an entity the size of Omaha, Nebraska. That's all the military. We're going to move them in 4 months to the Middle East. Huge undertaking. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, it's going to be the first time that the United States home front is going to be solidly behind its soldiers, Marines, and airmen since World War II, right? Korea, no. Vietnam, absolutely not. 2 little anecdotes about that. One of my West Point buddies, his wife, Linda Austin, sends me an email and tells me what they did at their school for one person. It was like a huge parade, and that went on throughout the country. And then my own personal reflection is I had a young lady in San Mateo California, a young lady named Linda Patterson. During the Vietnam War, her brother was in my unit that I now commanded in the 101st, and he was killed. And she organized the city of San Mateo, California, to adopt that unit, my Alpha company. Fast forward 25 years, she calls me up and asks, is there anything I can do before we deploy? I go, yeah, can you have every one of my soldiers get a letter? Well, dang if she doesn't do that. The city adopts my battalion, and when we land in Saudi Arabia, every soldier already had 1 or 2 letters from a pen pal. It's unbelievable. There's a book called Dove Among Eagles about all this that occurred. It's an awesome, awesome book. So those are the first. When we talk about ease, and it did look easy. If you're back in the United States, it looked like that the campaign itself went relatively quickly, didn't have a lot of casualties, and within 4 days, 100 hours of the ground campaign starting, it was over. Well, I think some of the lessons that can be learned is why did that occur, right? Because there was a book written right before this called First Battle. And in that, the thesis of the book was that every time the Americans went to war, they got beat. The first battle. That didn't occur here. So what I want to do is I want to go back farther, back to 1973, and explain about this odyssey of how the United States Army and the United States military writ large came out to this conclusion. So let's go back to 1973. And the Vietnam War was over, and the United States Army, and I'm going to talk specifically about the Army, was transitioning to a all-volunteer force. It was hard times, very hard times. I used to tell people, I said, I was pretty sure we couldn't, and I was in Germany in 73, we couldn't beat the Salvation Army, much less the Soviet Army. We got the name Hello Army. If you looked at the Gallup poll from 73, you know how they rate organizations. The United States military was dead last. Think that through. We were below Congress. Think it through. So how bad were we? Well, we were so bad, we got the name Hollow Army. We had disciplinary problems. We had drug problems. We had race relations problems. We looked at our doctrine. Our doctrine didn't look like it would do well against the Warsaw Pact. And then we looked at our equipment. And our equipment, much of it was obsolete. So what happened? Okay, I think, and again, this is just me, that if you go to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, this was the igniter on why things started to change. In the Yom Kippur War, we had on one side Israel, we had on the other side the Egyptians and the Syrians. In 1 month of modern, lethal battle, the Israelis, the Egyptians, and the Syrians together, all their equipment, they lost more tanks and artillery pieces than the United States Army had in Europe. And the people that remember the United States Army in Europe, that was a lot of equipment. Well, all of that, the equivalent of all that is destroyed. So the Army at that time, blessedly, had a bunch of smart lieutenant colonels, and some generals at this time. So they went and studied the war, and then they went out to the different units in the Army and briefed us. I was in Germany, a place called Schweinfurt, Germany. I'm a young, stupid lieutenant. Lieutenant, maybe if I was a first lieutenant, I was probably less stupid. But when I heard the briefing, even I understood this is a problem, right? If they're going to consume this much of equipment in that short of a time frame. So the Army started to change. It started its 17-year odyssey. And they're going to change in three different ways: in doctrine, technology, and training. And let me just cover them real quickly. In doctrine, up until this time, our doctrine said we were going to defend. Now, okay, fine. So the Warsaw Pact hits us in Germany at the Fulda Gap. They have more equipment, and we found out from the Yom Kippur War, in some cases, their equipment is better than ours. So we're going to lose. Eventually, they're going to try it, and we're going to lose in Europe. So the doctrine started to change away from this defensive mindset. And by 1986, the field manual that came out was 100-5, and we had a new offensive-oriented doctrine called airland battle. And you see the AIDS. What that means was the four tenets of it: agility, initiative, depth, and synchronization. Agility, what does that mean? That means our decision cycle is going to be shorter than yours, dude, right? We're going to be able to turn on a dime. You won't be able to. We're going to be more agile. Initiative, we're not going to stay on the defense. We're going to go on the offense. And again, that kind of suits Americans' temper anyway. We like to be on the offense. Depth, we're going to attack the battlefield all up and down, not just at the front line, but we're going to go to your rear, your logistics, your communication nodes. We're going to attack you back there. And then synchronization. Not only is the Army going to synchronize everything, but with our sister services, if the Air Force is there, particularly the Air Force, the Navy and the Marines, we're going to synchronize our movements and the way we fight. So this whole idea for the Army that I had been was revolutionary. New technology. The Army decided to prioritize, and we knew the weaponry that we had some of it was not as good as the Warsaw Pact. So in the Army, we're going to prioritize, and we came up with the big five. They were the M1 tank, the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle, which means you could fight from it, inside it, or get out of it. The Apache helicopter, attack helicopter, which is a death machine. The UH-60 Black Hawk, which allowed an infantry unit to double the amount of people that could go in one helicopter. Huey had 6. The Black Hawk, we could jam 14 combat loaded soldiers in there. And the last thing was the Patriot missile, which we could shoot down aircraft, and then once we found out with the right computer program, we can fight or shoot down other missiles. So those big fives were in some ways revolutionary. How good were they? Well, if you fast forward to today, 2020, and go and look at our combat systems, they're still all there. They've been upgraded, but they're still all there. New training methods, and perhaps of the three, I don't know, this might be the most important. Back in '73, say you're an infantryman, you have 100 things to do, and none of them are any more important than the other. Well, the Army, and they're the smart people, and there was one particular general I want to point out, a guy named Don Starr, and people in the Army know this guy. He became the training and doctrine commander, 4-star, brilliant fellow. We started to prioritize what we're doing. So for an infantryman, you got 100 things you got to do, not anymore. Here's 25. And we're going to give you, here's your task, here's your conditions, and here's the standards that you got to execute the task. You have to know these 25. That other 75 that were more or less superfluous, yeah, whatever. But these 25 you have to know. Oh, by the way, we're going to train you to this standard, and then every year we're going to come back and we're going to retest you. And if you don't know and you can't execute these essential tasks to standards, you're in trouble. You might not get promoted for it. They did the same thing at the collective level, a squad or a platoon or a company or a battalion. We're going to cut down your task, and we're going to prioritize them. And we're going to say, here's your task, here's your conditions, here's your standards. Learn it, know it, and be able to execute to standard. And oh, by the way, we're going to come either once a year or perhaps every other year, we're going to evaluate you. And the people that evaluate you are going to be from another unit, so they're going to be objective about it, to whether or not you can do what you're supposed to be able to do. And we believe if you can do that, you're going to be successful on the battlefield. So it became on your onus. If you can't get it done, well, there's consequences again if you can't get it done. For the staffs, and I'm about to get off of this, but at the staff level, at brigade, division, and corps, there are people that organize and coordinate. Well, they were given tasks to do too. And every other year, outside evaluators came in to see if they could do those tasks, conditions, and standards that they were required to be able to. And again, they were prioritized. Last thing, training centers. The Army spent a ton of money building these world-class, and for a better word, laser tag training centers. One was in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, that simulated the jungle. One was at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, that was in the desert. And then one was at Hohenfels, Germany, that represented a NATO-type environment. At these training centers, you came to it, you brought all of your equipment, and then you were going into a force-on-force contest with what they call the world-class OPFOR, or opposing force. This unit stayed at that location, and their only mission in life was to train so hard that they would beat you unmercifully. And they did when a force-on-force contact. And so what you did is, from all those beatdowns that you got over the week or 2 weeks that you were there, you learned lessons. If you had an Achilles heel or Achilles heels, well, you learned about it, and then you could take care of it. Reagan's election. When President Reagan was asked about his Cold War strategy, he said, it's simple. We win, they lose. We win, they lose. Oh, okay. So if you're a military guy, you go, I dig that, but that, again, that's rhetoric. Well, what his administration did was they provided the resources, they provided the funding, and they provided the political backing for the Army and the entire U.S. military to reinvent itself, right? Because, like I said, 1973, we're dead last, or 72, we're dead last in the Gallup poll. By 1990, we're number one, right? We're number one. Last thing on our odyssey, the 17-year odyssey. If you were in the military, and especially in the Army during the 80s, like, it was a great time to be there, because your emphasis not only on yourself, but on your unit. It was lethality. That was your job. Make yourself and your unit as lethal as you could. And we had that whole be all you can be. Well, that was true. Creative thinking was encouraged. Risk-taking was encouraged. And all this power that used to be held up here at the top was thrown down to the supporting units. So, like I said, be all you can be was the motto, and we went about doing it. All right, this is a schematic of the land campaign of Desert Storm, right, 24 to 28. But I want to just take a little time to build this up. And how did we get here? Like I said, we being the military and the civilian conquerors that did it, the equivalent of Omaha, Nebraska, to the Area of Responsibility, the AOR. So we start building up, starting in August, in Saudi Arabia in the rounding era. And economic sanctions were put on Iraq, and diplomatic sanctions. We were working through the United Nations, and pressure was being put on Iraq. But I go back to Saddam Hussein. He's a thug. He's a pirate. He doesn't care what economic sanctions. He's still got his beluga caviar and champagne. He doesn't care what his soldiers are going through or what his people. So by January the 17th, it's done. And the air campaign, and we have an air campaign that goes from January 17th to February the 24th. And Warren reminded me the initial shot of this air campaign was by the first of the 101 Apaches, the Apache helicopters that went in and knocked out the early warning radars. So the night of January the 17th, 5,000 sorties are flown, and we lost six aircraft that first night. And what were they trying to do? Really two things. One, they were hitting the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military's command and control nodes, radar stations, and places where they could command and control. They were going to hit those first, and then they were also trying to sweep the airs and get not air superiority, but air supremacy, which means if something that had Iraqi markings on it flew, it was going to die. So in about 5 days, that mission was accomplished. So what they did after knocking out the command and control nodes and getting air supremacy was they started to go after the field forces, primarily the Republican Guard units, which had the best equipment for the Iraqis, and started to go after those field forces. The number that always drops out or gets to me is the U.S. military and the coalition dropped 88,500 tons of ammunition. But again, I go back to Saddam being a thug. He's not going to move. He's just not going to come out. So on February the 24th of 1991, the ground campaign starts. So let me just go over that or semi-quickly. On the right hand, if you're looking at the map, on the right hand side, there's 4 pink arrows. Well, that's the Air Coalition, along with the 2 MEFs from the Marine Corps, along with Army assets, primarily tank units, that went into Kuwait and Kuwait City. So they're going through the trench lines, they're going through barbed wire, they're going through the minefields. Off the coast of Kuwait, the Navy had an amphibious task force. They had a bunch of ships, and they had Marines on board. And this was a feint, F-E-I-N-T, or deception. What they were trying to do was, I don't want to say the word pretend, but pretend they were going to conduct an amphibious attack on Kuwait's east coast. And of course, the United States was famous for the World War II amphibious attacks, and as late as the Korean War in China. And the job was done. They held the Iraqi armored forces more or less in place from counterattacking. In the far west, 300 miles away, we have 18th Airborne Corps, and that was the 24th Mechanized Division, the 101st Airborne Division, which I will talk about later, the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 6th Brigade Mechanized Division. The 18th Airborne Corps' mission was to drive north and cut the Euphrates Valley, which was about, 200 miles to the north. And there was a road that ran through the Euphrates Valley. We were going to cut that highway. It was Highway 8, and that prevented any reinforcements going into Kuwait and any Iraqi forces trying to go back to Baghdad. We're cutting it both ways. The unit, and I'm going to be real parochial here, that had the biggest deal was the 101st. The 101st was going to go in on the first day, 100 kilometers, set up what they call a forward operating base, which would turn into a gas station. And the next day, another unit would go and cut Highway 8. So in 36 hours, that highway is cut. And then for those helicopters of that second unit, they'd have to come back to that FOB and fuel up on gas to get out. In the center of your picture is 7th Corps. And 7th Corps, which was a very big, mean, heavy armored corps. Their mission was on the next day, after the situation had developed, to drive north, and that would be February the 24th, and destroy anything in their way. And then eventually curl right, go east, and encircle the Republican Guard units, their tank forces, and destroy them. So did this work? Absolutely. In 100 hours, again, we went through the 4th largest army in the world, and war's over. So let me get out of this strategic that I'm talking about right now, and I'm going to drop down sort of where the rubber meets the road at the tactical and operational level. So this great picture here is a picture of the commanders of the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault. Why do they call it Air Assault? Well, the 101st was unique at this time because it was the only air assault division in the world, which means it had a tremendous amount of helicopters. And we could pick up a brigade. A brigade is about 2,000 soldiers and take them maybe 120 miles, drop them off, and then come back. No one else had that capability. So just to point out some of these guys, first row there, that's all the division commanders there. There was the division commander, Major General Benny P. To his left and right is General Shelton and General Adams. To the far left is Chief of Staff Joe Bolt, and then there's Division Command Sergeant Major. Behind them are all the brigade and battalion commanders. Battalion commanders, that's what I was of. About 700 people, brigade had 2,000. If my brothers or my West Point buddies or my sons are looking for me, I am in the last row, third from your left as you look at it. And the guy that kind of looks like Brad Pitt or whatever. So were these guys talented? Yeah. 4 of them are going to become 4-star generals. General P is going to be CENTCOM commander. General Shelton is going to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. My boss, Tom Hill, is going to become the Southcom commander, and my West Point buddy, Dick Cody, is going to become Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. Along with those 4 stars, we're going to have 4 3-stars, 4 2-stars, and 1 1-star. And again, for my Carlisle buddies, a dance instructor. So this is the plan. When you look at it, if it looks confusing and complicated, that's because it was. So let me just try to explain a little bit, then I'm going to throw my own perception of this plan. The original position of the 101st from August all the way to January, into January, was underneath Kuwait, or due south of Kuwait. In our plan, called for us to get on C-130 aircraft, load up, and fly 300 miles to the west to a place called Rafah. And when we did that, the C-130s would pick up, they get up, I don't know, 400 feet up in the air and do nap of the earth, which in itself was interesting, 300 miles. Rest of the divisions, all our vehicles are going to drive about 100 miles south into Saudi Arabia, then hook a right, then go up to get to Rafah. All this was supposed to be double top secret, probation type stuff. No one's supposed to know we're moving. And it sort of worked that way. So when we got out to the far west, and Schwarzkopf called this the Hail Mary, that some of you might remember. On the first day, the 1st Brigade, and that is the unit that I'm going to be associated with or assigned to. We're going to go 100 miles and establish Forward Operating Base, or FOB Cobra. The next day, the 3rd Brigade is going to fly over top of us, go another about 100, I think it was another 150 kilometers, and land on Highway 8 and cut it, right? And then their helicopters coming back to our base. And on the last day, or on the 3rd day, 2nd Brigade is going to go up, hang a right, and go east toward Basra. And again, each one of these lifts is about, ours was a little bit bigger, but it was 2,000 or more people are going to go do this. So, great plan, complicated. Let me give you my perceptions, 2 little vignettes about it, and then I'll tell you how it turned out. The first time I saw this map, and again, this is a little vignette about it, this was top secret, and only the battalion commanders got to see it. Brigade had it, and they had it in their tent, and they had a tarp or a towel over top of the map. So I'm sitting in the front row, and they pick up the towel, and I'm looking at the map, and my first thought was, where the hell am I? Because Kuwait wasn't on it, and I don't have any reference points that I know where I'm at, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm the only person, you know how insecurity hits you. I'm the only person here that doesn't know where we're at. In fact, nobody knew where we were at. It was like you're studying the city of Philadelphia's, their roads. And then they tell you you're going to attack, and they throw a picture up of Boston. So number 1, I have no idea where we're at. Number 2, I see these big blue arrows going north. And when they go up and they cross over, that means it's going to be an air assault, or you're going by helicopter. And then I thought to myself, again, this is all happening within about 60 seconds. I'm going, damn, I didn't say anything, but we're actually going to go do this. Because up until this time, this is a theory. Yeah, we can go do this. Yeah, but you're thinking, but no, this is a lot of anti-aircraft that we're going to go through, anti-aircraft fire. And then the last thing, I'm looking at the map and I'm trying to find out where my unit is. And then I see my unit is the first unit to go. And then I don't know what happened. I'm thinking this through. I guess the blood drained out of my face and I have the deer in the headlights look. So again, this all happened within about 60 seconds. And my brigade commander was kind of smiling. He says, well, Frank, what do you think? And what I wanted to blurt out is I want to find the lunatic that thought this up. Couldn't. So I gave the weakest and most unenthusiastic ever, hooah. Oh, okay, hooah. So that was my first perception. It's confirmed a little bit because in about 3 weeks, we had the French over. The French 6th or Brigade Division is going to link up with us after 2 days. And I asked them, it was a young captain, I said, well, you've seen our plans, what do you think of it? And he, being a young Frenchman, looked at me, deadpan, and says, well, it looks like the movie A Bridge Too Far. And for all you historians, that's the airborne drop in Holland in 1944 that went dramatically wrong for the Allies. So how did it work out? It worked out great, sort of great, right? In 2013, they took this plan and they put it in a newly minted field manual 3-90 called Tactics as the offensive maneuver that best exemplifies what that should look like. It was almost perfect as the way they described it. And on the defense side, just for you historians, they used Kursk, the Soviets' defense at Kursk. When this was over, and again, a little bit about that lightning of Desert Storm, Schwarzkopf was quoted about Desert Storm. He said, in Desert Storm, the armor and the Air Force were the thunder, but the lightning was Desert Storm. So how'd this go in reality? Well, perhaps one of the omens I should have known, but I didn't, was the day before this goes, Barbara Bush and Lee Greenwood, the guy, God bless the USA, they came to Fort Campbell to rally the troops. And I'm going, oh, okay, fine. Okay. All right, I learned this later. So, did it go all according to plan? In one word, no, it did not. Maybe 2 words, hell no. This is a painting by James Dietz done in 2001 that when you read the blurb, it's about my battalion, 1st 327, landing in Cobra. And this is going to be the great war story I'm going to tell about in this, and it's most of it's true. And so, I'm not going to talk about this. I think I'm supposed to be the guy with the binoculars looking like he doesn't know what he's doing. But what I want you to look in the background is the high ground back there. And this great war story I'm going to tell you about thinking soldiers is why am I not up there and why am I down here? So here goes the great war story. This is my battalion S2, Captain Jose Delgado. And S2 is your intelligence officer. I had an intelligence officer to discern where the enemy was. He's the guy on the right, looking like Rip Van Winkle there, sleeping. He's talking to Captain Jerome Hawkins, our fire support officer from the artillery, and the big dude there smoking is my chemical officer, Tom Evans. Delgado is the hero of this story. He and his running buddy, his sergeant, Jesus Gonzalez. They were kind of like my Hispanic connection, Jose and Jesus, right? A little bit about Jose. He's brilliant. He was extremely hardworking and he was an inquisitive. How brilliant? He's now the director of counterintelligence for the Department of Energy. And so, like I said, this story kind of tells his tale. Now, this is a shamelessly photographed map I took from a book called Death Ground by Lieutenant General Dan Bulger. And I want to use this, but I have to go back in time a little bit to tell the whole story, and it won't take too long. In October of 1990, I found on my bunk a magazine. And of course, you're always trying to read something. I brought War and Peace, and I never got through it, but you're trying to find something to occupy your time. And in this magazine were excerpts of a new book. The book was written by Lieutenant General Hal Moore and newspaperman Joe Galloway. And they were excerpts from the upcoming book, which hadn't been printed yet, called We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And there's going to be a movie made out of it, but that's a decade in the future. So I start reading these excerpts, and what it was about was an air assault. Again, folks getting on helicopters and going attack someone by the 7th Cavalry in Vietnam in the Ai Drang Valley in 1965. And what happened was it went dramatically sideways. A lot of casualties. There was another unit that was involved in this. They got beat up. And the lesson that I learned from it was you can't land on entrenched enemies. So I had my company commanders read it, and then I had my battalion commanders read it. And I said, read this. And collectively, we said, we're not going to do this. We're just not going to do this. So we fast forward now to the end of January and February. And so going back to this photo here, the section of this Ford operating base, and you have to understand the size of it. The size of the operating base, it was bigger than Fort Campbell for those people that have been there. Huge. And my section was about 15 kilometers north-south and 15 kilometers east-west. So that's whatever that is like 225 square kilometers, right? And in it were about 20 different locations that had possible enemy there. And one of them, you see on the slide there, is an Iraqi trench. This trench was almost 1 kilometer long, which is about 10 football fields. And it was relatively, it was like 10 feet across, 10 feet high. And unfortunately, it was on a plateau. And unfortunately, the plateau was the exact location when I told you we're going to bring airbags back in the afternoon, the neck of the attack, where we were going to put the blivets of aviation fuel. And the reason why is the soil there was as such that when the helicopters came down, you wouldn't have a brownout from the rotor wash. So that's where we're going to put all this aviation fuel. So over top of the, what it says, trench line was the word unoccupied. And unoccupied means what? Unoccupied. There's nobody there. So I have the Corps, 18th Airborne Corps, the division, 101st, in my brigade, 1st Brigade, all telling me, and 1st Brigade gave me where I was going to land. This is the unoccupied trench line. Now I go back again to Delgado, my thinking captain. He is, like I said, bright, inquisitive, and what he could never understand, and he explained it to me later, he says, why would somebody in the middle of the desert build something so long, all that engineering effort, and not put something in it? And you think to yourself, I don't know, that's a damn good question. Why would they do that? So he and his buddy Gonzalez, I would see him over in the corner in our headquarters tent. They would be looking and looking and looking, and we did not. I talked to a lot of computers. We didn't have a computer, so they were hand looking and comparing different coordinates. So in January the 22nd, they hit pay dirt. Wherever he got it, I'm not sure, but he got some imagery, which I know we weren't supposed to have, but he called in a favor, I believe, and he got this imagery. And the imagery clearly showed there were Iraqis in and around the trench line. So I come in at, it was about 8 o'clock at night. I had come back from a meeting at my higher headquarters, 1st Brigade. I walk in, there's Gonzalez, there's Delgado, there's my S3 Major Dempsey, my XO, John Chappell, my great Sergeant Major Riley. And when I saw their faces, I thought two things. First, my mother had died, or two, somebody had been shot while I was away at the brigade. And Delgado, he speaks up, he goes, sir, we got a problem. There's somebody in our 1st and it was Alpha Company that was going there, the first LZ. Okay, so he explains it to me. Makes eminent sense to me. So I said, okay, get in a Humvee. I got my driver, get in a Humvee. We're going back to brigade. So we put on our slugger, go through the night, find our way back up there, and we bring in the brigade commander, Colonel Hill. To say that the meeting was spectacularly unsuccessful is an understatement. In retrospect, the only good thing that happened out of that meeting was I didn't get fired for being insubordinate, because I had an exquisite, some of you folks may have heard it, exquisite stream of profanity that I was using, and I lastly took off my helmet and threw it on the floor. And Delgado's using logic, I'm using passion, it's not working. And in Colonel Hill's defense, we're late. Like in 48 hours, we're leaving. There's going to be somewhere between 250 and 300 helicopters in the sky at the same time, at dark, going to disparate landing zones. And now, a young 26-year-old captain comes in along with a lieutenant colonel who might be, for all he knew, getting jittery about going to do this. So he says no. So we both, we get back in the Humvee, we go back, and we're not talking a lot because, again, you're running through the kind of what ifs as you go back. In the morning, 8 hours later, whether by divine intervention or his own gut check, and again, Hill was a good officer. He's a Vietnam vet guy, and he knew what he was doing. He changed the LZ. So we get, you can push it back 2 kilometers. Okay, great. So fast forward now 36 hours. We were supposed to go in the dark, 4:30, but one of these shamals came up. So we pushed it back. We're going to land in the daytime, 100 kilometers deep. So what happens? Well, when we land, because there's so many so many people in the helicopter, you basically land on top of each other. Each person would sit back, and you'd straddle the guy leaning back. We more or less rolled out of the helicopters. And the first thing that I heard were this heavy machine gun, which I later found out to be 4 GPU, ZPU, not ZSU, but ZPU machine guns firing. And I'm thinking to myself, that's not the Apache. So we organized ourselves, and eventually we had an attack, an entire attack battalion of Apaches. We had, after they ran out of gas, we had a Cobra attack battalion come in. We had 2 F-16s. They had 2,000-pound bombs. We had 2 A-10s with 500-pound bombs. And then we had brought in a battery of 105 artillery, and we shot every round except 6. We had 6 rounds when the flags came up. And we are going to find, and again, up until this time frame, I'm thinking, well, maybe there's 30 or 50. Well, there ended up being an entire battalion of 344 Iraqis come out of that trench line. And we got the surrender, but their mission, and just a little bit about their mission was on the reverse side of that plateau was a huge highway, which they correctly believed the French were going to come down, and they were going to ambush. Why didn't anybody see them? Well, again, in his book, Death Ground, General Bolger described it as they were like Flash Gordon's mole men. They dug and disappeared. And it was, when you got to the other side of it, you understood why nobody saw it, because they were inside the hill. They had bunks, they had a TV in there, and that's why everybody thought it was unoccupied. So on the left quadrant up there, that's another little painting about what occurred. The lower left, top right, that's some of the equipment, and that's myself in my S3. It's a photo, but it was taken with my Instamatic, and I told whoever took it, I said, nobody's going to believe that there were that many people here. So that will sum up. Okay, that's it. I just want to give you what I think were some of the lessons learned of it. Yeah, right on an hour. And then if anybody has any questions, we'll ask, or you can ask. At the strategic level, I think if you're a, in quotations, superpower, you have vital interest, you should never, ever be on the wrong side of the technological curve of your weapon, right? If we had fought this conflict with our 1980 equipment, which was entirely possible, the M60 tank or F4s instead of F-16s, well, we would have probably won, but it would have been a different outcome. Two, the Bush administration told us to defend Saudi Arabia and then eject the Iraqis. Two doable missions, right? And so that's probably not, and again, I know there's not necessarily black and white all the time with missions, but they were both doable missions. And the third thing, at a strategic level, there is nothing that can do you a bigger favor than have a well-trained, hard-nosed professional military. That military in 1990, and this is not me, I got some other comments, and I think it is true. It was the most professional military we ever had that went into that entered a foreign combat, right? At the beginning, right? Everybody else, they had lost battles. Not this time. It wasn't going to happen this time. At the lower level, and again, if there were any lieutenants or young folks, you have a brain. Use your brain. The people that figured out, and this was Delgado and Gonzalez, one was 26, one was 22. They used their brain. They worked hard. They thought through the problem, and they came up with a solution. It wasn't the generals. It sure as hell wasn't me. They thought it up. As one of my lieutenants who became a colonel, Matt Karras, he told me about 2 years ago, you know, there's a lot of children and grandchildren running around because of the thinking of two young men. Last thing, along with that thinking, it's imperative on the person that's in command or running the business or whatever. You get advice, well, listen to them, right? That's important stuff. If you don't listen to them, then nothing's going to get done. If you just think, I'm the smartest, well, you may be, but not all the time. So you can listen to it and do it. I listened to Delgado, my boss, after he slept on it, listened to me, and then his boss, whoever he talked to up at the 101st, they allowed him to do what providentially turned out to be a great move of letting us move that landing zone back. Again, if you and I never do like to think through it, but if you can imagine, it would have been 98 folks landing in the middle of the dark. That was the plan on that unit, and it just been way too much of a hard day. So that's it. I hope it educated you a little bit. I hope it entertained you a little bit, to all my my folks out there that know me. So I think if there's any